I assume if you've watched this channel for any time, you're aware of the Yuuzhan Vong War. About 20 years after the Battle of Endor, the Yuuzhan Vong invaded from extragalactic space, killing hundreds of trillions, including Chewbacca and the youngest Solo child Anakin, in what was the most destructive war in Star Wars history. Surely, after that, things calmed down and the galaxy found peace, right? Wrong. Today, we'll be talking the Second Galactic Civil War and more. Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to another video. As many of you know, I run a podcast called TapCaf Transmissions. It's essentially a Star Wars book club. For several years now, we've been rereading Star Wars Legends, and we've recently started Legacy of the Force. I encourage you, by the way, if you're interested, to check out the episodes and even read along if you'd like. The link is down in the description. But the reread, I thought, has offered me a good opportunity to revisit certain topics I've touched on in the past. We did the same thing a couple of months ago with the Dark Nest Crisis. Today, we'll talk the Second Galactic Civil War and specifically how the war started. This will cover content from the first two novels of Legacy of the Force, which is a 9-book series, but I've read, of course, them all in the past, so I'm going to present this all holistically with some future information as well. Alright, so to summarize, the Yuuzhan Vong invade about 20 years after the Battle of Yavin, or the original Star Wars movie. That war lasts 5 years, after which the galaxy is left to rebuild as the Yuuzhan Vong essentially go out on their own in peace. Subsequently, Jacen Solo goes on a spirit quest across the galaxy, learning esoteric force techniques, and honestly, getting a little weird. In 35 ABY, 5 years after the Yuuzhan Vong invasion, there's a small conflict known as the Dark Nest Crisis. Then, 5 years after that, 10 years after the Vong invade, we have the beginnings of the Second Galactic Civil War. It's important to understand where this conflict stood within the broader context, because a lot of the frictions we see emerging are really a result of the last 10 or so years. As I discussed in my Swarm War videos, aside from a general focus on rebuilding, one of the most important changes in the galaxy from before and after the war was the transformation of the New Republic into the Galactic Alliance. Again, I went over this in depth in my first Swarm War video, but in short, the Galactic Alliance was a reorganization of the New Republic, which also brought other factions, including the Empire, into the fold. The idea was nice. You have essentially a large unified government across much of the known galaxy. But you might remember the last 2 times the galaxy tried that didn't end so well. I'm referring, of course, to the Republic, which was shattered by the Clone Wars, and the Empire, which was destroyed by an internal rebellion. The Galactic Alliance would get unfavorable comparisons to both the Empire and the Republic during the Second Galactic Civil War, but let's start with the Empire. I really think it's the more apt comparison. The Second Galactic Civil War is essentially kicked off by feisty Corellians. Unlike the New Republic in Star Wars canon, or the pre-Clone Wars Republic of canon and legends, the Galactic Alliance, probably still wary after their encounter with the Yuuzhan Vong, placed a big emphasis on the creation of a powerful GA navy. Member systems were meant to provide ships and or resources to the Galactic Alliance as a form of taxation. Additionally, there were limits placed on the size of planetary and sector defense forces. So again, this is unlike the pre-Clone Wars Republic, which instead of relying on a central military, allowed individual systems to protect themselves. Several powerful industrial, especially shipbuilding worlds, but we'll focus on Corellia for now, had a major issue with this centralized power, and Corellia especially levied accusations of imperialism against the GA. Basically, the central government wants all the power, wants to control member systems. We've seen this before, we're not down. Corellia was unique not only because of its importance in the galaxy generally in terms of shipbuilding, economics, and more, but also because within the Corellian system there was a massive superweapon known as Centerpoint Station. Centerpoint Station had been inoperable since the Yuuzhan Vong War, but the Corellians under Chief of State Jacen Solo, who at the best of times was a madman, were trying to reactivate the station, something the Galactic Alliance was not willing to allow. It's also worth noting that following the Swarm War, Luke's Jedi Order was heavily integrated with the GA, something we'd see change as the war progressed. However, during these early days, the Jedi were tools of the Galactic Alliance, and in 40 ABY, Jacen Solo, child of Ben and Leia, alongside his apprentice Ben Skywalker, child of Luke and Mara, launch a covert mission to disable Centerpoint Station as simultaneously the Jedi attempt to eliminate Corellian political leadership as the GA also dispatches a fleet to the system. And if you feel like the Jedi being this involved in political actions is improper, pay attention to that. The GA and the Corellian fleet do end up engaging with each other. The GA retreats, but symbolically occupy Tralis, one of the 5 planets in the Corellian system. Well, on Corellia itself, the Jedi dispatched there are unsuccessful at capturing Solo or the Prime Minister, but importantly, Jacen and Anakin do manage to at least temporarily disable Centerpoint. I'll make a video on that later because what they have running Centerpoint or attempting to is absolutely wild. Crazier than you think, I'll say that. However, Centerpoint is not destroyed. The Galactic Alliance fleet would eventually withdraw from the Corellian system as a whole after the Battle of Tralis, where Han Solo and Wedge Antilles, having essentially defected from the GA, lead an attack on the GA forces there. And if you're also starting to notice that things are very messy, again, keep paying attention to that. Wedge is a great example. Obviously, he's a hero of the Galactic Alliance, but as tensions begin to rapidly escalate, he's essentially arrested, with the GA worrying that he'll leave as a Corellian and go join Corellia. He probably wasn't planning to, but he does escape custody and serves for a time within the Corellian military. The Solo and Skywalker families are being torn apart as well. Han is a staunch Corellian supporter, even though Corellia isn't really home for him anymore. He believes, rightly I think, that the GA is overstepping. Leia supports him. Luke generally feels conflicted but supports the Galactic Alliance, taking us to Jaina and Jacen, the Solo twins. We'll focus on Jacen for today's video because he really is the major player during this war. Jacen is falling to the dark side. He meets a long-lost Sith known as Lumaya, a character who first appeared in the 1970s and 80s Marvel comics. Funny enough, I mentioned that he was a practitioner of esoteric force techniques. That's probably putting it lightly. Jacen was perhaps the most knowledgeable Force user in the galaxy. Not as powerful as Luke, who was a Grand Master at the time, but Jacen had studied so much across the galaxy and believed that it was his duty to keep studying more. He wasn't quite brash like Anakin, his grandfather, a figure he looked back to, sometimes literally, quite often. Jacen is seduced to not really the dark side, but Sith teachings by Lumaya, who tempts him with the lesson of Lord Vectivus, a Sith Lord who never did evil. Whether that story is true or not, hard to say, but Jacen believes he can become a Sith Master and it will essentially complement the rest of his teachings. He even wonders what it will be like living with Luke or around Luke, with the two having different philosophies. Obviously, Jacen doesn't understand what becoming a Sith Lord entails, and he has his own sort of arrogance. He looks back at the fall of Anakin and sees someone who was ignored, who is in an unhealthy relationship, and he believes rather that his new Sith powers can simply help him find order alongside his prior teachings. And Jacen, especially earlier on, tries to be a good person, but it's this drive for order which really ends up escalating the war and furthering his path down the dark side. So, back on Coruscant, there are 2 terrorist attacks. One is a bombing, the second is a poisoning of the city's water supply. A lot of the second book, by the way, takes place on Coruscant, so if you like that city, check the book out. Either way, thousands are killed, which seems like a lot, but on a planet of trillions, it's really kind of just another Tuesday, but public perception has swayed hard towards fear and anti-Corellianism. I don't know if that's a word. Either way, The GA is being infested by several people looking to secure power for themselves. One is Jacen, who believes he can establish order. The other is Cha Niathal. Others include senators and those within Coruscant security forces and intelligence. Either way, the GA is looking to establish a new anti-terrorist police task force. Initially, Mara Jade is asked. She declines. Jacen eagerly takes the role and establishes the Galactic Alliance Guard, a Gestapo-like police force which aggressively begins anti-Corellian measures, including internments, arrests, expulsions to Corellia, and more. Things are rapidly getting out of hand. Jacen is doing a lot of stuff which is simply not cash money. He's obviously drawing comparisons to Vader, and not just his 501st, but also the Jedi Purge, alongside his 13-year-old apprentice, Ben Skywalker. And you've got to remember at this point, the Galactic Alliance is made up of many, many ex-Imperials, many even current Imperials. So when the Galactic Alliance Guard starts calling themselves Stormies, or one of the guardsmen says to Jacen, my grandfather served along your grandfather, and that's why I wanted to work under you, it's not wholly surprising. And it's also not wholly surprising that the GAG ends up being very, very imperial. Many innocent civilians are killed or interned. Jacen ends up torturing and killing a prisoner during an interrogation, a woman who happens to be the child of Boba Fett. And to put it simply, Jacen is falling to the dark side. Luke sees it and wants Ben away. Jaina sees it. And the galaxy, although maybe not focused on the individual, sees the Galactic Alliance slipping towards the Empire. We'll end today with a setup of Book 3. Jacen convinces Cal Omis to blockade Corellia, not only preventing outside traffic from entering the system, but also stopping travel from the surface to the various orbital stations so that those within the Corellian shipyards, for example, are weeks away from starvation. Cal Omis, who's the chief of state at this point, is kind of an interesting character. He took over after the death of both Borsk Falia, the last chief of state, and really the New Republic as a whole. Cal Omis is the first chief of state of the Galactic Alliance, and he's essentially handpicked by the Jedi during the Vong War. Partially, they don't say this, but he seems like a bit of a doormat, so perhaps it's not a surprise that as the Second Galactic Civil War is ramping up, Jacen and others step all over him, and he really does very little of his own designs. Jacen and Cha Niathal, who I mentioned earlier, would take more of a direct role later on, but we'll get to that in a future video. Anyway, the blockade is the beginning of the end of the war. Other systems test the Corellian blockade. This results in several bad moments, including Jacen Solo shooting down a fleeing transport. And yeah, Jacen's kind of weird at this point. He's jumping back and forth between the Galactic Alliance Guard and the blockade. Additionally, Han, who's on Corellia, is contacted by a rival politician to the Corellian chief of state, again, Jacen Solo, cousin of Han, named Durgeddon, who wants Thrackan out of the picture. Han is cool with this because Thrackan is an asshole. He's put a hit out on Han's family. He's generally just a radical, and Han accepts, not because he needs the money, because he wants Thrackan dead. He's threatened his family, his children, his wife many times. He ends up teaming up with Boba Fett. That's a complex can of worms, but Boba essentially is very sick. His tissue is coming apart, partially because of the cloning, but also his time spent in the Sarlacc. He's just riddled with tumors. He needs to track down his original genetic information, and that journey leads him to Han Solo. They partner. I'll cover that probably in the next video. But as I mentioned, that is the end of the beginning, so we will end things here. Next time, we'll probably talk about the early Confederation, Luke's indecision over whether to continue serving with the Galactic Alliance, and more. But if you've got any questions, please let me know with the hashtag AskEck. If you want to know something specifically about the things I talked about in this video, make the hashtag AskEckLegacy. But that's all for now. See you next time.